Frank Miller pulled his black SUV into the driveway of his new home, a modest three-bedroom house in the Oak Ridge subdivision. After 15 years as a deputy U.S. Marshal chasing dangerous fugitives across the country, he was looking forward to some peace and quiet. This quiet suburban neighborhood seemed perfect for the occasional downtime between his high-stress assignments. He stepped out of his vehicle and took a deep breath. The late afternoon air carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and backyard barbecues. Children rode bikes at the far end of the street, and an older couple walked their golden retriever along the sidewalk. It was exactly the normal, peaceful life he rarely got to experience. Just what the doctor ordered, Frank mumbled to himself as he grabbed a box from the back seat. He had moved in most of his belongings the previous weekend, but a few items from his office had taken longer to pack. Frank was halfway to his front door when he noticed a woman standing at the edge of his lawn. She wore crisp khaki pants and a pale blue polo shirt with Oak Ridge HOA embroidered on the chest. Her arms were crossed, and her lips were pressed into a thin line. "Excuse me?" she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Are you the new owner?" Frank set down his box and approached with a friendly smile. "Yes, ma'am, Frank Miller just moved in last weekend." The woman didn't return his smile. "I'm Diane Keller, president of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association." She held out a business card between two perfectly manicured fingers. "I noticed you've installed a security camera without proper approval." Frank glanced at the small camera he had mounted above his garage the day before. It was a habit from years of law enforcement. Basic home security was second nature to him. "Oh, I apologize, I didn't realize I needed permission for that. I'm happy to fill out whatever forms are necessary." Diane's eyes narrowed slightly. "All exterior modifications require pre-approval. It's clearly stated in Section 7.3 of the HOA bylaws, which you should have received at closing." She pulled out a small notebook and wrote something down. "I'll have a formal notice sent to you. The camera will need to be removed until the board approves your application." Frank kept his expression neutral, drawing on years of dealing with difficult people in high-stress situations. "I understand, but given my profession, home security is important. I'm a deputy U.S. Marshal." For the briefest moment, Diane's stern expression faltered, but she quickly recovered. "Your profession is irrelevant to our community standards, Mr. Miller. Rules apply to everyone equally. If we made exceptions, everyone would want them." Before Frank could respond, a friendly voice called from next door. "Diane, are you already harassing our new neighbor?" An elderly woman with silver hair and kind eyes approached from the neighboring yard. She carried a covered dish in her hands. "I'm simply informing Mr. Miller about our regulations, Betty," Diane said, her tone suddenly more formal. Betty Johnson shook her head slightly and turned to Frank. "Don't mind our HOA president. She takes her job very seriously." She handed Frank the dish. "Homemade lasagna. My husband Paul and I thought you might appreciate a home-cooked meal while you're settling in." Frank accepted the dish gratefully. "That's incredibly kind of you, Mrs. Johnson. Betty, please. And welcome to Oak Ridge." She lowered her voice. "If you need any help understanding the many rules we have here, just ask." Diane cleared her throat loudly. "As I was saying, Mr. Miller, you'll receive a formal notice. The camera needs to be removed within 48 hours, or fines will begin to accrue." Frank nodded, keeping his tone respectful but firm. "I'll review the bylaws tonight and submit the proper application. But I should mention that my security measures are related to my work as a federal officer." Diane's posture stiffened. "I'll note your special circumstances in the violation report, but the board will make the final decision." With that, she turned and walked away, her back rigid with disapproval. Betty waited until Diane was out of earshot before speaking. "A U.S. Marshal? How exciting. And don't worry too much about Diane. She treats this subdivision like her personal kingdom." Frank smiled. "I've dealt with all types in my line of work. I'm sure we can come to an understanding." Betty's expression turned serious. "Just be careful. Diane has made life very difficult for people who cross her. The family that lived here before you moved out because of her constant harassment." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Really? Over what?" "They painted their front door navy blue instead of the approved forest green. Betty said with a sigh. 3 months of daily violation notices and fines. They finally gave up and sold the house, at a loss. Frank glanced in the direction Diane had gone. That seems extreme. That's putting it mildly, Betty agreed. Anyway, don't let me keep you. Come over for coffee sometime. Paul makes the best blueberry muffins in the county. After Betty returned to her home, Frank carried his box and the lasagna inside. His years tracking fugitives had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about Diane Keller set off warning bells in his mind. Not dangerous exactly, but definitely someone to watch carefully. The next morning, Frank found an official violation notice taped to his door. It detailed the unauthorized security camera and demanded its removal within 48 hours. He also found a copy of the 57-page HOA bylaws in his mailbox with a yellow sticky note marking Section 7.3. Frank read through the document as he ate breakfast. The rules were extensive and oddly specific. Grass could be no taller than 2.5 inches. Holiday decorations could only be displayed 14 days before and 7 days after the holiday. Garbage cans could only be visible on collection day and must be returned to storage within 12 hours. He filled out the security camera application form and included a brief letter explaining that as a deputy U.S. Marshal who sometimes handled high-risk fugitive cases, basic security measures were essential for his home. He walked the documents to the HOA office, a converted bedroom in Diane's house at the entrance to the subdivision. Diane wasn't home, so Frank left the documents in the mailbox marked HOA submissions and went about his day. He had a week off before his next assignment, and he planned to use it getting settled in his new home. 3 days later, another notice appeared on his door. His application had been denied. The security camera violated the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. The notice included a new fine of $50 per day until the camera was removed. Frank sighed and called his supervisor, John Peterson. Hey, John, quick question about protocol. My new HOA is giving me grief about my security camera. Given the nature of our work, are there any federal provisions that would override local HOA rules? John chuckled. HOA troubles already? There's actually a departmental memo about this. Forward me the denial and I'll send you the official letter. Federal officers are permitted reasonable security measures regardless of HOA restrictions. Later that afternoon, Frank attended the weekly HOA meeting held in the community center. When the floor opened for resident comments, he stood up. I'd like to address the board regarding my security camera application. Diane, sitting at the center of the table, frowned. The board has already ruled on that matter, Mr. Miller. I understand, but I'd like to submit this letter from the U.S. Marshal's Service. Frank handed copies to each board member. It outlines federal provisions that permit law enforcement officers to implement reasonable security measures at their residences, regardless of HOA restrictions. The other board members, 2 older men and a middle-aged woman, looked uncomfortable as they read the letter. Diane's face grew increasingly red. This changes nothing, she insisted. Our community has standards. One of the older men cleared his throat. Actually, Diane, this seems pretty clear. Federal regulations would supersede our bylaws in this case. Diane glared at him. We'll need to consult our attorney. She turned to Frank. Until then, the fines stand. As the meeting continued, Frank noticed other residents giving him sympathetic looks. Afterward, several people approached to introduce themselves, including Betty and her husband Paul. That took courage, Paul said, shaking Frank's hand. Nobody stands up to Diane. Frank shrugged. I've faced worse than angry HOA presidents. Betty lowered her voice. Be careful. Diane doesn't like losing, and she has a long memory. As Frank walked home in the gathering dusk, he noticed Diane watching him from her porch. Her expression made it clear. This was not over. Not by a long shot. Frank Miller had faced down armed fugitives and criminal organizations throughout his career. He never expected his toughest battle would be in a quiet suburban neighborhood with a woman wielding HOA bylaws instead of a weapon. But he'd been through worse. Much worse. Little did he know, Diane Keller was just getting started. 2 weeks after the HOA meeting, Frank Miller's life in Oak Ridge subdivision had become a daily battle. Every morning he found a new violation notice taped to his front door. His grass was half an inch too tall. His mailbox was not the exact shade of black approved by the Architectural Committee. The American flag on his porch was displayed incorrectly. The list went on, each violation carrying a $50 fine. Frank kept all the notices in a folder, along with photos disproving each claim. His grass was precisely cut to 2.5 inches as specified in the bylaws. His mailbox was the standard model sold at the local hardware store with Oak Ridge-approved stickers on the box. His flag was hung according to federal flag code, which superseded any HOA regulations. He was drinking coffee on his porch when Betty Johnson walked over from next door, carrying a basket of fresh muffins. "Good morning, Frank," she said, offering him the basket. "Paul's blueberry muffins, as promised." Frank took one and bit into it. "These are amazing. Please thank Paul for me." Betty sat down in the chair beside him. "I see Diane's campaign is still going strong." She nodded toward the latest violation notice on the small table. "Apparently my garden hose is improperly stored, even though it's in the exact same hose reel that everyone else on the block uses," Frank said with a sigh. "She's determined to drive me out." Betty lowered her voice. "You should know that Diane has connections at the township office. Her brother-in-law works in code enforcement. When she can't get her way through the HOA, she sometimes makes calls." Frank nodded. "I figured as much. Yesterday, a township inspector showed up claiming there had been a complaint about unpermitted renovations. He was very apologetic when he realized there were no renovations happening and admitted someone had called it in anonymously." "That would be Diane," Betty confirmed. "She did the same thing to the Alvarez family last year. Every few days, a new inspector would show up at their door." Frank's phone buzzed with a text message from his supervisor. He had a new assignment starting Monday, a fugitive transport from Denver to Washington, D.C. He would be gone for at least a week. "I'm heading out of town for work on Monday," he told Betty. "Would you mind keeping an eye on the place? I have a feeling the violations will multiply when I'm not here to document them." "Of course," Betty said. "Paul and I will take pictures of anything suspicious. We're retired, so we're home most of the time anyway." Frank spent the weekend preparing for his trip and securing his house. He set up a second hidden camera in his backyard, connected to his phone so he could monitor things remotely. His gut told him Diane wouldn't be satisfied with just leaving notices while he was gone. Monday morning, Frank left for the airport before dawn. By noon, he had arrived in Denver and was preparing for the prisoner transport. He checked his phone during a break and found 3 messages from Betty. The first was a photo of a township water utilities worker checking his water meter. The second showed the same worker wandering around his backyard. The third was a text. "Something strange is happening. The worker spent 30 minutes in your yard but never touched the water meter." Frank thanked Betty and checked his security camera footage. The water utilities worker had spent most of his time examining Frank's doors and windows. He had also taken pictures of the security camera. That evening, Frank called Officer Greg Simmons at the local police department. He had met Greg briefly when filing his change of address with local law enforcement, a standard practice for U.S. Marshals when they move to a new jurisdiction. "Officer Simmons, this is Deputy Marshal Frank Miller. I need to report suspicious activity at my residence." Greg sounded concerned. "What's going on, Marshal?" Frank explained about the fake utilities worker and the ongoing harassment from the HOA president. "I'm out of town on assignment, but my neighbors have been documenting strange visitors to my property." "I know Diane Keller," Greg said with a sigh. "She's a frequent caller to the department, usually reporting minor complaints against her neighbors. But impersonating utilities workers crosses a line. I'll drive by your place a few times during my shift and speak with your neighbors." "I appreciate it," Frank said. "I'm handling a prisoner transport, so I won't be back until next week." Over the next 5 days, Frank received daily updates from Betty. A building inspector had attempted to enter his house but left when Paul asked to see official identification. Someone had called animal control to report a dangerous dog at Frank's address despite him not owning any pets. The local fire department had been sent to check a reported gas leak that didn't exist. Each incident was more serious than the last, and each one was traced back to an anonymous call. Betty and Paul took photos of every visitor and wrote down times and details. Officer Simmons increased patrols in the area and filed reports about the false calls to emergency services. On Thursday night, Frank's security camera caught two men in dark clothing examining his house at 2 a.m. They tested windows and door handles, careful to stay in shadows. When they discovered the windows and doors were securely locked, they retreated to a car parked down the street. A car that Frank's camera captured driving slowly past Diane Keller's house afterward. Frank immediately called Officer Simmons, who responded to the scene but found no one. The officer reviewed the security footage and agreed it showed a serious escalation. "This has gone beyond HOA harassment, Marshal Miller," Greg said during their phone call. "This looks like preparation for breaking and entering. I'm filing a formal report and requesting increased patrols for your street. Have you received any threats related to your work as a marshal?" "Nothing recent," Frank replied. "My current assignment is a standard prisoner transport, low risk. This feels personal, not professional." "I agree. Everything points back to Diane Keller." Greg paused. "The problem is proving it. The men in your footage were careful to keep their faces hidden, and we can't clearly see the license plate of their vehicle. We can speak to Ms. Keller, but without hard evidence linking her to these men, she'll just deny everything." Frank thought for a moment. "Let me handle this my way when I get back. Keep the patrols going, but don't confront Diane yet. I want to see how far she's willing to go." On Sunday afternoon, Frank returned home to find his yard littered with violation notices that had accumulated during his absence. The fines now totaled over $2,000. Several notices warned of imminent legal action if the fines weren't paid immediately. Betty and Paul invited him over for dinner that evening and showed him their detailed log of every strange visitor and incident. They had documented over a dozen suspicious activities in just 1 week. "The whole neighborhood is talking about it," Paul said as he served pot roast. "Most people think Diane has gone too far this time, but they're too afraid of becoming her next target to say anything." Betty nodded. "She's been president of the HOA for 8 years. Nobody runs against her because she makes life miserable for anyone who challenges her authority." Frank reviewed their notes. "You've done excellent work. This is exactly the kind of documentation I need." "What will you do?" Betty asked. Frank smiled slightly. "I'm going to give Diane exactly what she wants, a confrontation, but it won't go the way she expects." As he walked home later that evening, Frank noticed Diane standing in her driveway watching him. Instead of avoiding her, he walked directly toward her house. "Ms. Keller," he called out, "I'd like to discuss these notices you left while I was away." Diane's expression hardened. "The fines are clearly outlined, Mr. Miller. Payment is due within 30 days, or the HOA will pursue legal action." Frank kept his voice calm and professional. "I think we both know these violations are fabricated, just like the false reports to township officials and emergency services." "I have no idea what you're talking about," Diane said coldly. "But I would advise you to comply with the HOA regulations if you wish to continue living in Oak Ridge." Frank held her gaze. "Is that a threat, Ms. Keller?" A small smile appeared on Diane's face. "It's a statement of fact. Some people simply aren't a good fit for our community." As Frank turned to leave, Diane called after him. "The HOA board meets tomorrow evening to discuss next steps regarding your property. I suggest you come prepared to either pay your fines or face the consequences." Frank didn't respond, but as he walked away, he knew the confrontation was coming to a head. Diane Keller had escalated from petty harassment to potentially criminal actions. She clearly believed she was untouchable. She had no idea who she was really dealing with. The next evening, Frank Miller decided to skip the HOA meeting. Instead, he called his supervisor, John Peterson, and briefed him on the escalating situation with Diane Keller. He sent over all the documentation he had collected, including the security footage of the men examining his house at night. "This is serious, Frank," John said after reviewing the evidence. "These aren't just annoying HOA violations anymore. This looks like harassment and possibly conspiracy to commit breaking and entering. That's my assessment too, Frank agreed. I've been documenting everything, and the local police are aware of the situation. Do you want me to send someone to back you up? John asked. Frank thought for a moment. Not yet. Let me see how this plays out first. I suspect Diane is planning something big after I missed the meeting tonight. Keep your service weapon close, John advised, and call for backup at the first sign of trouble. I don't like the pattern I'm seeing here. After hanging up, Frank checked all his windows and doors, making sure everything was secure. He cleaned his service weapon and kept it within reach. Years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now they were telling him to stay alert. The following day was Saturday, and Frank decided to do some yard work. The weather was perfect. Sunny, but not too hot. He set up his grill in the backyard, planning to cook burgers for lunch. Betty and Paul waved to him from their yard, and he invited them to join him for a cookout. Around noon, as Frank was preparing the grill, he noticed movement at the side of his house. Through a gap in the fence, he saw 3 men approaching. They wore dark blue uniforms with patches that read, HOA Enforcement Division. Each man had a holster on his belt, though Frank couldn't see what type of weapon they carried. Frank remained calm, continuing to arrange the charcoal in his grill, as if he hadn't noticed them. He had positioned his service weapon on the kitchen counter, visible through the open patio door but out of direct sight from the yard. The 3 men reached his back gate, and the leader, a heavy-set man with a buzz cut, called out to him. Frank. Miller? The man asked in a gruff voice. Frank looked up, feigning surprise. Yes? Can I help you, gentlemen? The leader pushed open the gate and entered Frank's yard without permission. The other 2 men followed closely behind. We're with HOA Enforcement, the leader said, pointing to his patch. We need you to come with us to address your outstanding violations. Frank noticed that while the uniforms looked somewhat official, at first glance they were poorly fitted and the patches appeared to be hastily made. These weren't real security officers or law enforcement. They were hired thugs dressed up to look official. I wasn't aware the Oak Ridge HOA had an enforcement division, Frank said calmly, setting down his grilling tongs. May I see some identification? The leader reached into his pocket and pulled out a laminated card with the Oak Ridge HOA logo. I'm Carl Richards, Chief of HOA Enforcement. Ms. Keller has authorized us to detain non-compliant residents until they agree to pay their fines and follow community regulations. Frank noticed that one of the men had moved to block the gate, while another was positioning himself between Frank and the patio door. They were trying to cut off his escape routes and separate him from his weapon. That's interesting, Frank said, taking a step toward the patio door, because I'm pretty sure homeowners associations don't have the legal authority to detain anyone. The leader, Carl, moved his hand to his belt, where Frank now saw a taser holstered. We have authorization from the HOA board. You can come quietly, or we can use necessary force to ensure compliance. Frank glanced beyond the men and saw Diane Keller standing at the edge of his property, watching the scene unfold with a satisfied expression. Several other neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, looking concerned but unsure what to do. Frank needed to defuse the situation before it escalated further. These men clearly believed they had some kind of authority, and that made them dangerous. Gentlemen, Frank said, before this goes any further, there's something you should know. He took another step toward the patio door. The man blocking his path put a hand on Frank's chest. Stay where you are, Miller. In one smooth motion, Frank sidestepped the man's hand and reached through the patio door to retrieve his badge from the counter. He held it up for all 3 men to see. Deputy U.S. Marshal Frank Miller, he announced loudly enough for the watching neighbors to hear. What you're doing right now is impersonating law enforcement and attempted illegal detention of a federal officer. All 3 of you are under arrest. The color drained from Carl's face. The other 2 men looked at each other in confusion, clearly not having expected this turn of events. This is some kind of joke, Carl said, but his voice lacked conviction. We work for the HOA. Homeowners associations are civil entities with no law enforcement powers, Frank explained calmly. They can issue fines and pursue civil remedies for violations. They cannot detain people or form private police forces. What you're doing right now is a federal offense. Frank reached past his badge and picked up his service weapon. Now, all three of you are going to place your hands on your heads and kneel on the ground. The two men flanking Carl immediately complied, but Carl hesitated, his hand hovering near his taser. I wouldn't, Frank warned. Assaulting a federal officer would add years to your sentence, and based on the look on your face, I'm guessing Ms. Keller didn't mention my profession when she hired you. Carl slowly raised his hands and knelt on the grass. Frank pulled his phone from his pocket and called Officer Greg Simmons. Officer, this is Deputy Marshal Miller. I need assistance at my residence. I have 3 suspects in custody for impersonating law enforcement and attempted illegal detention, and you might want to bring an extra patrol car for Diane Keller, who appears to have orchestrated this entire situation. While waiting for the police to arrive, Frank secured the 3 men with zip ties he kept in his emergency kit. He collected their tasers, which turned out to be actual functional tasers, not toys, and the handcuffs they had brought to detain him. Betty and Paul had witnessed the entire confrontation from their yard and hurried over once the men were secured. Are you all right? Betty asked, her face pale with worry. I'm fine, Frank assured her. But I'd appreciate if you and Paul could give statements to the police about what you saw. Of course, Paul said. We saw everything, including Diane watching from across the street. Frank looked over to where Diane had been standing, but she was now hurrying back toward her house. She won't get far, he said. This has gone well beyond HOA disputes. Within minutes, police cars arrived with sirens blaring. Officer Simmons was the first to reach Frank's backyard, his hand on his holster until he assessed the situation. Deputy Miller, he said, looking at the 3 restrained men. When you said Diane was escalating, I didn't expect this. Neither did I, Frank admitted, but it ends today. As additional officers secured the 3 men and led them to patrol cars, Frank explained exactly what had happened. He showed Officer D. Simmons the fake badges, the tasers, and the handcuffs the men had brought. These guys were prepared to abduct me over HOA violations, Frank said, and based on the security footage from last week, I suspect they were also the ones checking my house for weaknesses. Officer Simmons shook his head in disbelief. I've seen HOA disputes get ugly, but nothing like this. This is criminal. And that's why we need to speak with Diane Keller immediately, Frank said. She orchestrated this whole thing. Together, Frank and Officer Simmons walked toward Diane's house, where they could see her frantically making phone calls through her front window. She had no idea that her plan had not only failed but had landed her in serious legal trouble. The neighborhood had changed in an instant. The fear that had kept residents silent for years had been broken. As Frank and Officer Simmons approached Diane's house, neighbors emerged from their homes, many offering to provide statements about the years of harassment they had endured. The HOA Queen's reign of terror was about to end, and Frank Miller, the quiet U.S. Marshal who had only wanted some peace and quiet, had become the unlikely hero of Oak Ridge subdivision. Diane Keller was still on the phone when Frank Miller and Officer Greg Simmons reached her front door. Officer Simmons rang the doorbell while Frank stood slightly to the side, watching through the window as Diane's expression changed from annoyance to fear. She opened the door just a crack. What do you want? I'm in the middle of an important call. Ms. Keller, Officer Simmons said firmly, we need to speak with you regarding an incident that just occurred at Deputy Marshal Miller's residence. Diane glanced at Frank, then back to Officer Simmons. I don't know anything about any incident. 3 men claiming to be from an HOA enforcement division attempted to detain Deputy Marshal Miller at his home, Officer Simmons continued. They had tasers and handcuffs. They stated they were acting under your authority. Diane's face paled, but she quickly composed herself. That's ridiculous. The HOA doesn't have an enforcement division. Someone must be impersonating HOA officials. Frank E. stepped forward. Ms. Keller, multiple witnesses saw you watching the confrontation from across the street. The men had badges with the Oak Ridge HOA logo, and our initial questioning of the suspects indicates they were hired directly by you. This is harassment, Diane snapped, attempting to close the door. I'm calling my lawyer. Officer Simmons placed his hand on the door to prevent it from closing. Ms. Keller, please step outside. We need to continue this conversation at the police station. I'm not going anywhere, Diane insisted. You have no right to force me to go with you. Actually, we do, Frank said calmly. We have reasonable cause to believe you orchestrated an attempt to illegally detain a federal officer. That's a serious federal offense. Officer Simmons is being courteous by giving you the opportunity to cooperate voluntarily. Diane's composure finally cracked. This is all a misunderstanding. I hired those men as security consultants for the neighborhood. If they overstepped their authority, that's on them, not me. Security consultants don't carry handcuffs or attempt to detain residents, Frank pointed out. And they don't claim to have enforcement powers they don't possess. Officer Simmons read Diane her rights while another officer who had just arrived placed her in handcuffs. Neighbors watched from their yards and sidewalks as the HOA president was escorted to a police car. As they drove away, Betty approached Frank. Is it really over? She asked, her voice filled with both hope and disbelief. The harassment is over, Frank confirmed, but the legal process is just beginning. At the police station, the three men who had attempted to detain Frank were being held in separate interview rooms. Frank observed from behind one-way glass as Officer Simmons questioned Carl Richards, the leader of the group. Let me be clear about your situation, Officer Simmons said to Carl. You're facing charges of impersonating law enforcement, attempted illegal detention, possession of weapons with intent to commit a crime, and conspiracy. These are serious charges that could result in years in prison. Carl slumped in his chair. This wasn't supposed to go this way. We were told this was all legal. Who told you that? Officer Simmons asked. Ms. Keller, Carl admitted. She said the HOA had special powers under township regulations to enforce community standards. She said she had approval from the board and the township to form an enforcement team. And you believe that? Officer Simmons asked skeptically. Carl shifted uncomfortably. Look, I'm not a lawyer. She showed us documents that looked official. She paid us good money to be the muscle behind her rules. Said most people would comply once they saw we meant business. What exactly were your instructions regarding Deputy Marshal Miller? Carl hesitated, then seemed to realize his best option was to cooperate. We were supposed to bring him to the HOA office, which is really just a room in Keller's house, and keep him there until he agreed to pay all his fines and sign a compliance agreement. She said if he refused, we should hold him there until she could get a township official to come verify the violations. And if he resisted, Officer Simmons pressed. We were authorized to use the tasers if necessary, Carl admitted quietly. Keller said he was a troublemaker who thought he was above the rules because of his job. She never mentioned he was a federal officer. Frank had heard enough. He left the observation room and found the police chief, who had arrived after hearing about the incident. Chief Williams, Frank greeted him. I'd like to request FBI involvement in this case. Attempting to detain a federal officer crosses into their jurisdiction. Chief Williams nodded. Already made the call. They're sending agents from the nearest field office. Should be here within the hour. True to his word, 2 FBI agents arrived at the police station 45 minutes later. Special agents Lisa Monroe and Kevin Patel introduced themselves to Frank and quickly took charge of the investigation. This case has escalated beyond local matters, Agent Monroe explained to Chief Williams. What began as HOA harassment has now crossed into multiple federal offenses, including conspiracy to commit kidnapping of a federal officer. Agent Patel turned to Frank. Deputy Marshal Miller, we'll need a complete statement from you along with all the documentation you've collected regarding Ms. Keller's harassment campaign. Frank provided the agents with his detailed records, including dates, times, photos, and witness statements. He also gave them access to his security camera footage. This is very thorough, Agent Monroe commented as she reviewed the evidence. Most victims don't document harassment this carefully. Professional habit, Frank explained. When something doesn't feel right, I start keeping records. While the FBI agents conducted their investigation, news of Diane's arrest spread through the Oak Ridge subdivision like wildfire. By evening, the police station had received dozens of calls from residents wanting to provide statements about Diane's years of harassment and abuse of power. Betty and Paul Johnson organized an emergency meeting of Oak Ridge residents at the community center. More than 60 homeowners attended, a record turnout compared to the usual 5 or 6 people who came to HOA meetings. For years, we've lived under Diane's reign of terror, Betty told the gathered neighbors. Many of us have suffered from her harassment, but we were too afraid to stand up to her. Today that changes. The residents voted unanimously to remove Diane from the HOA board and to form a committee to review and revise the community bylaws. Betty was nominated to serve as interim HOA president until proper elections could be held. Back at the police station, Diane Keller was not cooperating with investigators. She had called her attorney, who advised her to remain silent. But the evidence against her was mounting. The 3 men she had hired had all provided statements confirming she had directed them to detain Frank by force if necessary. A search warrant for Diane's home in the HOA office revealed even more damning evidence. Investigators found detailed plans for harassing non-compliant residents, falsified violation records, and a list of officials Diane had influence over due to family connections or financial arrangements. Most disturbing was a folder labeled Miller that contained photos of Frank's house taken at different times of day, notes about his schedule, and a document outlining a plan to drive him out of the neighborhood through escalating harassment. Frank received a call from Agent Monroe that evening. "Deputy Miller, I wanted to update you on the case. Ms. Keller is being charged with multiple federal offenses, including conspiracy to commit kidnapping of a federal officer, which carries a potential sentence of up to life in prison." "That seems excessive for an HOA dispute," Frank commented. "This went far beyond an HOA dispute," Agent Monroe replied. "The evidence suggests Ms. Keller has been running what amounts to a local extortion scheme for years. She's targeted multiple residents, forced some to sell their homes at a loss, and used her connections to harass anyone who opposed her. Your case just happened to be the one where she finally crossed the line into serious criminal activity." Frank thanked the agent for the update and hung up. He sat on his porch looking out at the now peaceful neighborhood. Several neighbors waved as they walked by, some even stopping to thank him for standing up to Diane. Betty and Paul came over with a bottle of wine and 3 glasses. "To celebrate our liberation," Paul said with a smile. As they sat together enjoying the evening breeze, Frank realized something unexpected had happened. He had moved to Oak Ridge seeking quiet and privacy between his high-stress assignments. Instead, he had found a community that, once freed from fear, was warm and welcoming. "You know," Betty said, "the HOA committee is meeting tomorrow to start revising the bylaws. We'd love to have your input, especially regarding security measures for residents." Frank smiled. "I'd be happy to help. I think we could all use some reasonable guidelines that protect homeowners without turning the neighborhood into a prison." For the first time since moving in, Frank truly felt at home in Oak Ridge. Sometimes, he reflected, peace comes not from avoiding conflict but from standing up to bullies who disrupt it. 6 months had passed since the day Diane Keller sent fake HOA enforcers to Frank Miller's home. The seasons had changed, and the trees in Oak Ridge subdivision were now filled with spring blossoms. The neighborhood itself had transformed just as dramatically. Frank sat on his front porch swing enjoying his morning coffee. He waved to neighbors walking their dogs or heading out for work. Everyone waved back, many calling him by name. It was a stark contrast to the silent, fearful community he had moved into last year. Betty Johnson crossed the street, carrying a folder of papers. As the newly elected HOA president, winning by an actual vote rather than intimidation, Betty had led the complete overhaul of the community's governance. "Good morning, Frank," she said cheerfully, climbing the porch steps. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Frank offered her coffee, which she accepted gratefully. "How's the new job treating you?" Betty smiled. "Much better now that we've simplified the bylaws, 10 pages instead of 57, and most of those are about how to suggest improvements and resolve disputes peacefully." "A radical concept," Frank said with a grin. "Speaking of which, how did the security camera approvals go?" "Unanimous vote in favor," Betty reported. "After what happened with Diane, everyone agrees that basic security measures are a right, not a privilege." The new guidelines just ask that cameras be positioned to respect neighbors' privacy where possible. This was one of many changes in Oak Ridge. Under Betty's leadership, the HOA had transformed from an instrument of control into a genuine community organization. Monthly meetings were now well-attended social events where neighbors discussed improvements rather than violations. "I brought you these," Betty said, handing Frank several documents from her folder. "The final witness statement forms for the trial. The prosecutor wants to make sure everything is in order." Frank reviewed the papers carefully. Diane Keller's trial was scheduled to begin next week. After months of legal maneuvering, she would face charges including conspiracy, attempted kidnapping of a federal officer, extortion, and fraud. "How are people feeling about testifying?" Frank asked. "Nervous but determined," Betty replied. 28. Residents have agreed to testify about her harassment campaigns. Some have been waiting years for this opportunity. The investigation had revealed the shocking extent of Diane's abuse of power. For nearly a decade, she had used the HOA as her personal fiefdom, targeting residents she disliked with fabricated violations until they either submitted to her authority or moved away. She had collected thousands of dollars in unauthorized fines, which she kept for personal use rather than community improvements. Most disturbing were her connections to township officials. Diane's brother-in-law in code enforcement had filed false reports against her enemies, and a clerk in the water department had helped her target specific homes with inflated bills or service interruptions. Both were now facing their own legal troubles. "I still can't believe how long it went on," Betty said, shaking her head. "So many people were afraid to speak up." "That's how bullies operate," Frank noted. "They isolate their targets and make them think they're alone. Once people realize they can stand together, the bully's power vanishes." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Officer Greg Simmons, now a regular visitor to the neighborhood. He had been instrumental in coordinating the local police response with the FBI investigation. "Morning, Marshal Miller, Mrs. Johnson," Greg greeted them. "Just thought I'd stop by with an update. Diane's attorney tried for another plea deal yesterday." The prosecutor turned it down flat. "With the evidence they have and the number of witnesses coming forward, they're confident in taking this to trial." Frank nodded. "Good. Too many people have been hurt by her actions. They deserve to see justice done in court." Greg accepted the coffee Betty offered. "The case has actually led to a department-wide review of how we handle HOA complaints. We've developed a new protocol to identify potential harassment patterns." "That's excellent news," Betty said. "I've been working with HOA presidents from other neighborhoods to share what we've learned. Nobody should have to go through what Oak Ridge did." After Greg left, Frank and Betty walked through the neighborhood to the community center. The building, once rarely used except for Diane's sparsely attended HOA meetings, was now a hub of activity. Today it was hosting a spring festival planning committee. Paul Johnson was already there, helping set up tables with several other residents. "Frank, perfect timing," he called out. "We could use your expertise on security for the festival. We're expecting over 200 people, including families from neighboring subdivisions." Frank spent the next hour helping the committee plan a safe, enjoyable event. As a U.S. Marshal, his professional skills were valued by the community, but he was appreciated more for simply being a good neighbor. That afternoon, Frank received a call from Special Agent Lisa Monroe, who had led the FBI investigation into Diane Keller. "Deputy Miller, I wanted to give you a heads up. We've completed our financial investigation of Ms. Keller's accounts. In addition to the misappropriated HOA funds, we found evidence of money laundering and tax evasion. The U.S. Attorney has added those charges to the case." "How is she responding?" Frank asked. "Not well," Agent Monroe replied. "She still believes she did nothing wrong. In her mind, she was simply enforcing rules that others were too weak to uphold." Classic authoritarian thinking. After hanging up, Frank checked his calendar. He had another transport assignment next week, but he had arranged his schedule to be available for the trial. His supervisor, John Peterson, had been supportive throughout the case, recognizing its importance not just to Frank personally, but as a matter of justice. That evening, Frank hosted a barbecue in his backyard, the same yard where Diane's hired men had attempted to detain him 6 months ago. Now it was filled with neighbors enjoying good food and conversation. Children played on a swing set Frank had installed last month, and several residents had brought dishes to share. Betty and Paul arrived with their famous blueberry muffins. Officer Simmons came after his shift ended, bringing his wife and teenage daughter. Even Agent Monroe stopped by briefly, accepting a burger before heading back to the field office. As the sun began to set, Frank found himself in conversation with Sam Rivera, a resident who had moved in just last month. "I almost didn't buy in Oak Ridge," Sam admitted. "The neighborhood had a bad reputation for years. But then I heard about the changes, and when I came to look at the house, everyone was so welcoming." "The community has come a long way," Frank agreed. "Betty told me the story about how it all changed," Sam said, lowering his voice. "About you being a U.S. Marshal and standing up to that HOA president. I thought she was exaggerating until other neighbors confirmed it." Frank smiled modestly. "I just did my job. The real heroes are people like Betty and Paul who had endured years of harassment but still had the courage to speak up when given the chance." Later, as guests began to leave, Betty and Paul helped Frank clean up. "This was wonderful," Betty said, wrapping leftover food in foil containers. "Remember when none of us would even talk over the fence for fear of Diane reporting a noise violation?" Frank nodded. "When I moved here, I was just looking for a quiet place to relax between assignments. I never expected to find a real community." "Well, you did more than find it," Paul said, clapping Frank on the shoulder. "You helped create it." As Frank looked around his yard, now empty of guests but full of new memories, he felt a deep satisfaction. Throughout his career as a U.S. Marshal, he had pursued fugitives and protected witnesses, but helping free an entire neighborhood from a petty tyrant might be the most meaningful accomplishment of his career. He had come to Oak Ridge seeking peace and quiet. Instead, he had found something far more valuable, a true home and a community worth fighting for. In a twist of irony, Diane Keller's attempt to drive him away had instead given Frank Miller exactly what he needed, a place to belong. And for a man who had spent his life on the move, that was the greatest victory of all.